I've helped hundreds of companies put purchasing control in place because once companies start scaling and grow in the 50 to 100 employees range, you start seeing some of the common patterns. Everything is purchased using a credit card, or there's a lot of unauthorized purchases being done. And by the time finance comes to know about it, money's already spent and they can't do much about it, right? So in this video, I'm going to break down an exact step-by-step process on how you go about implementing purchasing controls in your growing companies. Let's dive in. Number one is you need to set up approvals and spending authority. So let's say if your company doesn't have a approval authority matrix in terms of who can approve what purchase, two things happen. Either A, there is uncontrolled spending, right? Because people don't know who's even they need an approval or not, right? That's number one. And number two is even if there are kind of, I would say, not clearly defined rules, they probably will go to whomsoever they can first. And then either A, it gets stuck in the whole approval process, or B, it takes a longer time. So either way, both is not good, right? Because if the spending is not authorized, you have uncontrolled spending. And if approvals are taking too long, that means people are not getting what they need at the right time. So operations slows down. And we see this in most companies when they try to put controls. The first thing they do is they try to implement some sort of policy which is not well thought. And the end result is usually operations slowing down. So what to do instead, right? So let's break it down step by step. First is you need to set up approval thresholds. So what do I mean by approval thresholds? Each organization has a hierarchy, right, of the structure in the company. So you have maybe a non-manager, a manager of people, then you have a director, you probably have VP controller or VP finance and so on, right? And it's two pieces, right? One is the finance hierarchy in terms of how the finance is structured, and second is the hierarchy of the department. So a clear way to think about this is each of those levels should have some sort of self-approval limit. So for example, a individual can spend up to, let's say, $500 without getting any approval. A manager may be able to kind of approve up to 10,000 or 1,000 or 5,000, whatever it is. A director can do up to, let's say, 10,000. A VP controller can do up to, let's say, 25,000. Above 25,000, it needs to go to the CFO. Above, let's say 50,000, it needs to go to CEO, and maybe above 100,000, it needs to go to board. So that's a clear example of how you set up different structures based on the hierarchy in your organization, but it doesn't have to stop here, right? So you need to kind of see you're setting the approvals in a way that it does not become a bottleneck. And the golden rule or rule of thumb to kind of think about that is you don't want it too easy for people to spend the money, but at the same time, you don't want it to become a bottleneck. So if every $5 purchase needs a manager approval, it is, you have caused a problem, right? So what I would suggest is, and what we kind of work with many companies to do is set up a basic process, and then over a period of time, we optimize it. And we optimize it by looking at where approvals are happening. So if you think about Pareto principle, which is 80-20, applies in pretty much everything, applies with your spend also. 20% of your transactions contribute to 80% of your spend. And if you're looking to control spend, you want to focus on that 20%, not the remaining 80% of the transactions, right? So look for the threshold below which you don't need to worry about a lot of approvals, but above the threshold, you need to look for those approvals. All right. So once you have defined the approval thresholds, the next thing is to set up the routing logic for approvals. So you might say, what's the difference? I mean, I already set up the approvals. So approvals kind of walk you through who can approve or who has the approval authority, but there might be specialized purchases that are happening in your organization where you need to involve other stakeholders. So a common example would be, let's say you're purchasing software subscription and it needs to go to IT because IT might have a contract with a third-party vendor from where they buy all the subscription licenses, as an example. On the other hand, maybe just a $500 office supplies does not need any more approvals other than the manager or depending upon whatever your approval limits are. So that's why it's important to understand not just the approval limits, but the routing logic. And that depends upon first, what are we buying? How often are we buying? And who are the different stakeholders that needs to be involved? So for example, if you're, let's say, pharma company and somebody's trying to put in a request and it's a new vendor. So yes, somebody proved that they can move forward, but pharma has very specific requirements for approved vendor list, right? You have R11 requirements to take care of and so on. So just make sure that you're understanding identifying all the different aspects and who needs to approve. So that's number 2. All right. Now you set up your approvals, right? You set up your routing logic. Now there are 2 more things that you need to do before we move to the next step. First thing is you need to handle escalations. A very common problem with approvals is approval sits in people's, whether they're traveling and they don't have time to look into it, or it's stuck in somebody's inbox, right? They don't have time to kind of go through it. Now there are ways to kind of handle it. You can have mobile app or things like that to kind of do the approvals. But when you're defining the policy, you need to have an escalation policy as well. So escalation means if a approval is not done in the 24 or 48 hours, whatever time frame you set up, it should automatically escalate to the next level in the approval. So for example, if it goes from a individual to a manager to a director, if the manager does not approve a request within 24 hours, it will automatically go to the director. Director can review and approve it. And the idea here is you want the process to be keep moving versus being stuck because somebody did not approve a request, right? So that's escalations. Now, once you define the escalations, you have one more thing to worry about, which is emergency purchase. Emergency purchase is the number 1 reason why you have maverick spending. So a maverick spend is when people don't use approved vendors or approved process to purchase something. So think about, let's say you're a construction company or you're a manufacturing company and you have a machine breakdown and you don't have the part available. Somebody goes to a local store, buy that part on their credit card, right? That's maverick spending because you might have a preferred vendor for that, or you might have a defined process. Now, most companies go wrong, and that's not their fault. I mean, nobody kind of thinks about these things in advance. But if you have an emergency purchase process, which means if it is an emergency purchase, it bypasses a lot of approvals. So what it does, it first tells them, hey, if it is an emergency purchase, you gotta check this flag. And because of which, what's going to happen is it's going to bypass your approvals, but finance still knows about it, right? So now finance has the visibility in terms of what is being purchased. And second is now you can go and track how many emergency purchase someone is kind of, putting in. So you can see if it is real emergency or somebody's trying to misuse the system, right? So worry about emergency purchases as well. And real quick, if you want help in setting up purchasing controls without worrying about how you're going to build all this from scratch, click on the link below to schedule some time with one of our product specialists. We have designed ProcureDesk exactly for this same purpose, is to give you purchasing controls, and all this is baked in one single system. Now let's go to step number 2, which is setting up your approved vendor list and purchase request process. So one of the biggest driver of uncontrolled spending is not having a approved list of vendors. So when you have an approved list of vendors, employees know what to purchase from where. So let's say you have negotiated a great contract for office supplies with Staples and people don't know about it, or they don't have a mechanism to enforce it. They will just buy from whomever they know from. They might go to Amazon, they might go to a local store, right? They go to Office Depot, whatever the case might be, right? So you have to have a centralized approver vendor list so employees can figure out from where to buy. Now you might ask why that is important, right? So there are 2 things. Number 1 is most of the times a recent survey from procurement professionals saw that maverick spending could be around 23% of your total spend if you don't have a approved vendor list. And 2 is you can save money by negotiating better costs by consolidating vendors. In our experience, it's 5 to 10% of your purchase, right? So if you're spending $1 million on supplies and you can consolidate your vendors, you can save up to $50,000 to $100,000 in this process. So how to go about building a approved vendor list? The process is pretty straightforward. So what you do is you look at last 12 months of spend data. We call this spend analysis. So you're looking at your past history. Maybe it's coming from your accounting system, or you can pull together some spreadsheet data. If you're using a P2P or a procure to pay system, this data is readily available, right? So you can look at that. So look at last 12 month data. Now you need to categorize it or group the vendors into buckets. So the categorization would be, for example, let's say we want to group everything for IT into one, or all the office supplies into one, right? And so on. And the next step is once you have categorized the vendors, you start looking at how many vendors we have in each bucket. So for example, if office supplies have 3 different vendors, that's an opportunity to consolidate the vendors, because, and especially we see this across multiple locations where each location have their own preferred vendor, but you could go to one national vendor and get better pricing. That step itself can save you 5 to 10%. So once you have the standard list, you need a way to make sure it is communicated out to different stakeholders, and having a procurement system helps a lot because you can just build the process in rather than trying to enforce it manually. All right. So now once you have your vendor list, the next step is putting that in your requisition process, right? So what is your request process? What do you need to capture when somebody puts in a request to purchase something? buying. Could be a brief justification of why they're buying, quantity, item, unit price, whatever the case might be. Now, once you have all that, system can route the request based on your spending approval limits, based on the process that we have defined previously, right? So maybe if it's IT, it needs to go to IT. Depending on the approval limit, it needs to go to a manager, director, whatever the case might be, right? So we are doing all that. Now, one of the challenge in the requisition process, what we see is companies define a requisition process which is like overwhelming for employees. I need to have everything I need to know, right? In terms of like what budget it is hitting or what chart of account is going to hit. I need brief like descriptions and so on. And what employees will end up doing is waste a lot of productive time in creating requisitions. And the easiest way to solve for things like that is, for example, punch out vendors. So instead of asking your employees to go to the preferred vendor site, copy paste the data and so on, you have a procurement system which is connected to those vendors, right? So let's take Amazon. You click on Amazon logo, it pops up the site, pick what you want to buy, click one more button, and it is sent back to your requisition process, right? So there's no need for copy pasting the data, copying what it is, links and all that. All that is gone, right? So think about the experience when you're thinking about the requisition process. All right. So step 2 is setting up an approved vendor list and a purchase request process. Now, step number 3 is add proactive budget controls. So far we have set up approval limits, we have set up requisition process and so on, but there is one main thing that is missing right now, which is proactive budget controls. So if you see here with the current process, right, people are approving and so on, but if you don't have a proactive budget control, finance does not have visibility into the budgets at any given time, which means a controller or a CFO has to wait for the month end to know where they are against that budget. And by the time you kind of see that you're gone over budget, it's already too late to control. And then you have awkward conversations with different stakeholders and say, oh, you went over budget. How do we fix it? And so on. Instead of that, we can build a proactive budget control process so that when an individual is putting in a request for purchase, whatever they want to purchase, we will check against the budget and say, all right, is this in the budget already or not? And if it is, great. Otherwise, you can set up budget controls. So a budget control might look like this. Let's say they put in a request for $1,000 and the remaining budget is, let's say $900, right? So they're over by $100. So what the system can do? Maybe it can block the purchase from happening. So there is no way the employee can actually make the purchase. Or maybe you want to put a process where you give them some leeway, right? Hey, you can go up by 10%, but not more. Or it needs to be routed to finance for further review and so on. So the idea here is if you're doing proactive budget controls, there's no way you can go over budget, right? That's the visibility finance needs at any given time. And honestly, that's the compliance part of it, right? So you're rather than now spending time on figuring out why we went over budget, you have a proactive control and finance can decide if they want to go over budget, then what other adjustments they are going to make. Right, so that's step number 3. Step number 4 is drive employee adoption. Now you can have the greatest system possible and process possible, but if employees do not use the system, right, you're not going to get spend control or better visibility that you're looking for. So when we start thinking about adoption, right, it kind of starts from the top because you can have a best system, you can have an easy to use system, all that is important, but your main department heads or leads needs to drive the adoption. They need to understand why this is important. So a lot of times we see when we roll out systems like this, we just kind of bring in few people and they are just brought in for training of a new system. And they really don't know why we're implementing this system. And what we have done is we work with companies to kind of give them a process. And the process looks like this. CFO goes to all the VPs and the direct report of a CEO or a CEO, depending on how big the organization is. And they explain why we're implementing this. A common process would look like, here's why we are seeing uncontrolled spending across different departments. And by having this, you will have complete visibility into your own department spend so that you exactly know how much are you spending. And that way you have the flexibility to control, if you want to shift the budget from one to another, and that way you have full flexibility. So it's shifting the accountability to them, but giving them a reason on why they should be doing this, right? Which is I'm making you accountable, but I'm giving you tools to do that. Now, what that drives is now they go and tell their, direct reports and so on that why we're doing this. And now you have given them a reason to follow the process rather than here's the process without explaining the reason, right? So that's kind of number 1, start from there. Number 2 is you need this as a part of your onboarding process. So what we see very common is HR will include purchasing process in their onboarding cycle, right? So when they're onboarding a new employee, employees get to know, hey, here's how we do purchasing, here's the system we use, here's the tool we use, and so on, or the process, whatever it is, right? So they get used to it. Second is you can set up like some sort of like most companies have internal portals where they can put link for purchasing process so that people can can watch videos or kind of review what the process is. Now, all that is great for adoption, right? This is all communication. But the other aspect of it is you got to make the process frictionless. So for example, we talked about having punch out vendors in the requisition process so that people can go to their favorite vendors, select what they want to buy, right? So that's reducing friction. Or having a mobile app where they can actually take a picture of the packing slip or approve something on the go, right? Approve an invoice, approve a requisition, or for that matter, create a requisition from the mobile app. These are the different ways you can reduce the friction, right? So that is one more step in increasing adoption. And finally, you want to track compliance. So what happens is when you launch a system or a process, there's always a need for optimization. And that could be for different reasons, right? One is you defined a process and it is probably working well, but there's things that are slowing it down. Maybe approval cycle times are not less than, let's say, we look for a benchmark of less than 24 hours. If it is more than that, something wrong is going on. But why the slowdown might be happening. Or a common other problem you would see is employees try to keep the requisitions under the threshold, right? So if I need to buy like something for, $1,000 and it's going to go to my manager, I might create 3 requisitions for 300 each, because then I'm bypassing the approval workflow requirements. So again, these are super important things to kind of track for that people are not taking advantage of the process, right? So when you're thinking about adoption, communicate, have it part of the onboarding process. You need to make sure process is frictionless, and fourth is track compliance. Now, at this point, if you're thinking all this makes sense, but I don't want to build this all from scratch, or I don't want this to be my full-time job, we get it. That's why we designed ProcureDesk, to help you with exactly this, right? So if you request a free demo by clicking on the link below, one of our product specialists will walk you through how you go about defining approval thresholds, right? Then defining your purchasing process, how the system kind of makes the whole thing frictionless by connecting to different punch outs. We'll talk about the mobile app capabilities and so on. And finally, how all this data is synchronized with your accounting system. Whether you use QuickBooks, Xero, Sage Intacct, NetSuite, we integrated with all of them, right? Most of our customers are live within 2 to 4 weeks. So it's a pretty quick process, and you will start seeing the impact on your month-end close or your approval cycle times within 30 to 60 days. So again, it's the first link. Click on that and schedule a time to talk to our product specialist. And if you are interested in knowing how AI can help you in procurement and account payable process, click on this link.